It's probably worth saying from the outset, I was incredibly flattered when I saw the agenda for today describing me as a partner at Deloitte. I'm not yet, but you know, you can have aspirations, can't you? I've been working now at Deloitte for about 6 years. During that time, I've spent probably about 4 years working with small and emerging banks. Alex asked me along today to give a little bit of a talk just about some of the opportunity that we see in the market at the moment, some of the activities that are ongoing, and a bit of a view of the process towards getting a banking license. My involvement with, I guess, small banks started at Metrobank alongside Fiona, so I worked with Fiona for probably, I think, 6 months. And then I stayed around with Metrobank post-launch until October of 2010. My role there was CIO, so you might need to forgive me slightly if I kind of wander down some of the IT avenues, although I will try and cover the whole wealth of bank launches. I guess it's worth noting, since I left Metrobank, they haven't had a CIO. I don't know whether I should be flattered or disheartened by that. So just before I kind of move on into the process itself, it's worth talking a little bit about what's going on in the market at the moment. And from our perspective, I see sort of 4 key areas within that market. So market dislocation. What I mean by that is there are a number of areas where the market itself is not functioning particularly well. And actually, there's opportunities coming out of that. So clearly, the LIBOR scandal recently, I guess, is an indication of some of the market dislocation. The fact that rates, particularly for savers, have been hit recently. The funding for lending scheme is a laudable activity, but unfortunately has had a hit on savings rates. People really aren't getting what they want from some of the retail high street banks. The other area of market dislocation, of course, is that some of the larger banks are being forced to sell off elements of their business. So most notably, I suppose, is Lloyds and RBS. There's also a lot of government pressure. Now, actually, this slide was written a couple of years ago. And the one thing I found interesting about it when I looked through it just earlier this week is the validity it's as valid today as it was a couple of years ago when it was written. On the government pressure side, back when this was written, Vince Cable was still rattling his sabre about getting change put in. The Commission on Banking was starting to talk about it. And over the following 2 years, we've started to see real movement, and you'll all have noted in the press last week statements that the FSA is looking at changing the process and making it easier to enter banking. But that's taken a long time to come through. And I'll touch a little bit later on some of my hopes for what the changes we'll see as a result of that. The incumbents also are badly damaged. I don't think it's any surprise to anybody to know, HSBC clearly took some damage as a result of the scandal in Mexico. Barclays has taken a hit over the PPI. A number of the other banks have been tarred with the same brush, and the lack of lending, particularly in the SME market, has also hit them. And from an investor perspective, actually, one of the things that has changed over the last 2 years is there's been a little bit of a change in angle. So when I was working at Metrobank, there were a number of other organisations, and particularly individuals out there who were quite keen to launch banks. Sandy Chen was looking to launch his bank. We had a brief conversation with a small organisation called Farthing & Co. There were a number of organisations that were looking to do greenfield implementations. That's changed a little bit over the preceding couple of years, really. And what I'm starting to see a lot more of now is organisations either trying to enter the country, so banks from other countries coming in. But actually, there's a growing trend amongst corporates to try to diversify their funding. So noted the point earlier about the fact that small and medium-sized organisations struggle with funding, but some of the large corporates are also struggling with funding. And we've spoken to a number of them recently about the opportunity maybe to launch a retail savings product so that they can tap both the wholesale funding market and the resale funding market should the markets freeze up or certainly slow down again. And I know there's a lot of challenges out there to launching a new bank, but there's also a lot of opportunity as well. And this slide really talks to some of the opportunity in the process of setting the bank up. Big banks, I think, are encumbered by complex IT systems. They're encumbered by complex processes. There's a lot of centralisation. Things don't really work particularly well. Simplicity is clearly an opportunity that is available to new banks within the market. And with simplicity, you can have agility, so you can adapt those processes, adapt your IT systems, adapt your culture to a certain extent to make change easier, make the adoption of new technologies easier, adapt to new regulations. And you can also keep cost down. And there's a number of different opportunities in that space. Clearly, keeping your processes simple is one thing, but particularly around IT now, there are real opportunities to buy IT as a service within the banking sector, particularly if you're looking to do a sort of building society style model without current accounts. Technology I've already kind of touched on, but there's within the technology space, when the current high street retail banks were setting up, of course, they were building their own technology, whereas now you can approach, there's a lot of organisations out there which you can approach to provide IT systems and services for you, right from some of the large market-leading organisations such as Temenos and Fiserv down to much smaller organisations which are literally dotted around the country, but most people have never even heard of. There is an opportunity around cultural flexibility. The main high street banks have a bit of I guess, a reputation for not being very welcoming. Metrobank, interestingly enough, took a very different approach. I don't know whether many of you will have been into a Metrobank branch, but their approach is very much about retail. It's very much service-oriented. And they took an interesting approach when they were launching, that they would attempt to really sort of gather staff for their branches from a combination of banking and retail backgrounds. So if they went out to dinner or went out to a cafe and got particularly good service, they would leave a card that said, your customer service has really impressed me today. Perhaps you'd be interested in interviewing for a job at Metrobank. And what they've tried to do there is meld that together to produce an environment where you're welcomed into your bank. Genuinely, I mean, last time I went to Metrobank, and thankfully nobody recognised me, so I could gauge things without being recognised. The nice thing was actually that I had my two children with me. They're 6 and 2 at the time. And somebody came up with a couple of sets of notepads and pencils, took them off to one side, got them colouring whilst I deposited money. And I thought that's lovely. There's a real opportunity to distinguish yourselves within the market through the way you approach people. And the other thing which I think has been covered to a greater extent today is market focus. The large banks tend to use blunt, genericized tools. As a consequence, their credit scoring and their loan process are quite cumbersome, I guess is the word I would use, and quite often result in queries going backwards and forwards from satellite sites through to head office or sort of centralized sites. The opportunity is here, and I firmly believe this, for smaller banks to set up to focus on industry segments and localities and really make that a specialism. And Bank on Dave was mentioned earlier. I think it's a good example, really, of where actually getting to know your local community and getting to leverage your experience and knowledge of the businesses and the opportunities in the area can grant you real understanding of the risks associated with lending to businesses. So that's plenty about opportunity, and I take on board, there were comments earlier about different ways of launching banks. So local authorities have the opportunity to take deposits. Bank on Dave has an interesting model in his own right. It's a peer-to-peer lending model. What I thought I would do is just take a little bit of time to talk about, if you wanted to go the full hog, the full 9 yards, what would you actually need to do to acquire yourself a license? Now, there's two really interesting things about this. One is, this is all the documentation you need to produce, and this has come off the FSA's website. That's the process up at the top there. And this is one of my, I guess one of the concerns, one of the things I'd like to see addressed actually when the changes come through, ideally, is to have a much more structured process, something that gives you the opportunity to understand, okay, well, if I submit my license to you, when am I actually going to have a conversation with you? When are you going to come back? When are you going to commit to give me an answer? Because actually, to get to that application stage and to produce all of that documentation that's required costs a lot of money. So it would be great to actually be able to have some kind of commitment early on through your pre-application process about whether or not the FSA really think that you can make a go of this. And secondly, actually just understanding once you've gone through all these hoops, once you've jumped over all of these hurdles, just to understand when the documentation is provided that you can expect a reply within a set period of time. And I'll just, 2 minutes, crikey. Right, so the pre-application process, a word of advice, if you go down this route, the pre-application process, it's your first opportunity to talk to the FSA. You need to go in well prepared. The documentation on the FSA website tells you that you have the opportunity to go in and discuss your opportunity. We always advise our clients to go in really well geared up for that conversation, have your business plan ready. And then there are a series of documents. I'm not going to go over them in too much detail because I've only got a minute and a half left. But just to run through, the key ones here are the regulatory business plan for me is absolutely key. I've seen organisations come unstuck on preparing and presenting their regulatory business plan. The ILA and the ICAP are relatively large documents, although you do have the opportunity at least there that the FSA provides guidance on the kinds of tests that you need to apply to your liquidity and capital in order to prove that your bank is viable. IT systems and services, clearly from an IT background, I regard that as extremely important. And then there are a number of other bits and pieces. The final one that's worth mentioning, I suppose, is outsourcing. Any key outsource, the FSA defines a key outsource as something that is critical or key to the business. Any key outsource must comply with the FSA's legislation around that, which is covered under CISC 8. So that's just a brief look at the process itself. I don't want to overawe you with what needs to be done. It's a relatively straightforward process. It just requires a significant amount of elbow grease. Just a quick example. So this is a little bit about Metrobank, where both, as I say, Fiona and I were involved with previously, just to give you an idea as to how the process might work. It doesn't work necessarily this way, and it's different for everybody. So we, Deloitte, were first involved in Metrobank in around about October 2007. I'm sure Fiona will tell you whether it existed pre that point, but certainly that's when we got involved and wrote the initial business case. It then took a good couple of years before today's current CEO, Craig, was recruited. From my perspective, I became involved in about July, and that is the point at which the business started to go from a dozen people working on documentation to start defining all of the processes and the IT system. So things really started to gear up at that point. And yet we were still producing documentation for the FSA. Lots of stuff was being churned out of the door, and lots of Columbo questions kept coming back. There would be we think one more question, just one more question. The license was finally acquired. Actually, it was the Minded 2 was acquired in February of 2010. The license itself came through early the following month. But you'll note it still took Metrobank 5 more months to launch. And that, to a certain extent, actually, was as a result of a lot of the IT testing, working with the agency banks, getting credit cards set up. Fiona wasn't joking earlier. It's not just the costs of working with the agency banks. Actually, sometimes it can be the process itself. It's a long and tangled process. Not every bank will work this way. I've seen banks come and go without ever even launching. We know of organisations that have been working with the FSA for over a year. So you shouldn't necessarily use this as a yardstick, but you need to understand, I guess, that the process itself can take a long time and requires people to really kind of stick at it to get there. Thank you very much.